by a distinguished colleague and well-known professor in machine learning, actually one of the founders of the major units on machine learning in United States, North America, around the world. So I would like to give very, very brief overview about Professor Mitchell, who is he, and the major distinguished things that he has achieved over the years. So it will be very, very brief. Professor Tom Mitchell is the founder's university professor at Carnegie Mellon University, a top university, I don't know, in the area of machine learning, where he founded the world's first machine learning department. His research interests include machine learning, artificial intelligence, cognitive neuroscience, and the impact of AI in society, a major topic in nowadays area of AI application. He has testified to the US Congressional Research Service and the US House Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs regarding potential uses and the impacts of artificial intelligence. He is currently co-chairing the US National Academy Studies on AI and the Future of Work. Professor Mitchell is an elected member of the distinguished US National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And he is also a fellow and past president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, major institute in the field of artificial intelligence. Professor Mitchell received an honorary degree from Dalhousie University for his research in machine learning and cognitive neuroscience. It is our great pleasure to have you with us, Professor Mitchell, to present us some of your recent work on the application of machine learning to study how brains function and the natural language aspect of it. Thank you.
And it really is very exciting to be here in the other machine learning department. Who knows, over the next 10 years, we should have a little bit of a competition forecasting how many machine learning departments there will be by 2032. I'll let you think about that during the talk. Okay, so today, what I'd like to do is describe a line of research that I've been involved in now for 20 years. But it's really, to me, a perfect example of how machine learning can disrupt and re-paradigm a scientific field. And so the question that I've been interested in, along with a number of my colleagues, is how the brain processes language. And when I say a number of my colleagues, here are some of those. I'll just point to Marcel Just, a faculty member in our psychology department, who introduced me actually to the field of brain imaging and taught me much of what I currently know about that field. And then I've worked with many wonderful scientists and students, postdocs, and so forth. So here's the question that I'd like to ask my neuroscience friends. I'm puzzled by their inability to give me a clear answer to this question. But the question is, once we understand the brain, what will be the form of the answer? What will the answer look like? Will it be a circuit diagram? People think not, because we've had the circuit diagram for worms like C. elegans for many decades, and we still don't understand the life of those worms. What will it be? And to me, it will, at least in part, have to involve a description of the computational processes. I think the answer to how the brain works will end up being something like a circuit diagram, something, but also a collection of descriptions at much more abstract levels about the computational principles and about the design principles of the brain. For example, what are the learning mechanisms down at the cellular level? And my neuroscientists continue to tell me that there's just one, it's Hebbian learning, and nobody's been able to find another one. And yet we can't quite figure out how Hebbian learning would give rise to things like neural network backpropagation and gradient descent methods. So there are a bunch of puzzles here. So if you ask me where we are in this study, I think we actually know quite a bit now about where in the brain is different kinds of neural activity involved in different kinds of processes. We know a little bit about when this activity occurs, the timing. We know very little today about the how question. And in fact, my talk today is organized in exactly these three sections: where, when, and how. So let's get started. Where in the brain does your brain encode information of different types while you're listening to me speak? We studied this problem in several ways, but one of them is by putting people in fMRI scanner, or let's say fMRI scanner for now, showing them stimuli like these, sometimes words, sometimes pictures, sometimes words with pictures. But one way or another, we're just trying to get people to think about a simple concept like hammer or drill or dog, whatever. And then we collect with fMRI an image of their brain activity, which looks like this. This is 4 slices of the 3-dimensional fMRI image when one person looks at this stimulus here, bottle. And as this thermometer indicates, red means high activity and green means kind of average activity. So that's what the data looks like. And so if you're interested in studying patterns of neural activity that represent different words, say, then the first question you have is, does it look any different if I give you a different word? And so I can show you the average activity we see over 60 different words. That looks like this. And you can see, well, maybe that's a little different than bottle. If I subtract out the mean activity averaged over those 60 stimuli from the activity for bottle, then you can see the difference. There is, in fact, some difference in these images. Could be noise, could be signal. I'll give it away. It turns out it's signal, or at least much of it is signal. Okay, so that's the kind of data we get to work with as we're trying to study the question, what are these distributed patterns of neural activity in the brain that represent different words in somebody's brain? So to study that, the first thing we did, being machine learning people, was to try to train a classifier that takes as input a brain image and classifies it according to which word the person is reading. So for example, could train a system by showing it, collect data from you and show it different images of when you read the word hammer and when you read the word bottle. Then we could test it on some new images drawn from you. And sure enough, it would be able to do this with quite high accuracy. In fact, if we do this across several different participants, we can see to distinguish, say, whether a person's viewing a word describing a tool like hammer, drill, or a building like house, apartment, then the system does quite well. Yes?
Is there a difference if instead of reading it, you hear it or you see an image of it?
Great question. The question was, is there a difference if you hear it versus see it versus read it? The answer is there are differences, but I'll get to this in a minute. I have a slide coming up. The differences are much less than you think. There's great commonality. Okay, so here you see the good news is we can use machine learning now actually in a very interesting way. If you think about what we're doing, there was a revolution in neuroscience in the mid-90s when brain imaging made it possible for the first time to look inside somebody's head and see what activity was there. but it didn't say anything about what information is there. And when we train these classifiers, each of these classifiers is essentially a new kind of sensor about information content. You think of every classifier you train to decode information. You're building a new tool. And so the miracle of fMRI is that we can see the activity, but the miracle of fMRI coupled with machine learning is that we can see what information is there. And in this particular plot, I'm presenting results where we use the entire brain image to decide which words you're looking at. But we could also train our classifier just to look at the left half of your brain, or the front half, or one of the 72 anatomical regions defined by a typical encyclopedia of brain anatomy. And we could start asking which part of the brain allows us to decode this information about the stimulus you're looking at. Okay, so we spent some time looking at these kind of issues and found, you asked just the right question, is it the same if you show a picture? Well, we realized we could convert every one of these questions into the equivalent machine learning question. So we can ask, well, are these representations similar across people? Well, we can turn that into the equivalent machine learning question. Let's train on people in this side of the room and then see if we can, using data from their brains, and then see if that trained classifier can successfully decode people in this side of the room. The answer is absolutely yes, with almost the same accuracy. So even though we're all very, very different, there's a surprising similarity in the neural code, in the patterns of brain activity that our brains use to represent, and here I need to be careful, to represent concrete nouns, to represent objects. By concrete noun, I just mean noun describing something you can touch, like a hammer or a house. And so we found, in fact, at one point, there's a show in the US called 60 Minutes. They came to interview us about this work. And during the interview, Leslie Stahl was our interviewer, and we put the associate producer of her show in the scanner during the interview. And the system showed her 10 words, and we gave it 10 binary choices. Is she reading the word strawberry or skyscraper? And during the interview, it was correct 10 times out of 10. We expected that because we never would have put ourselves through that kind of interview if we hadn't tried it before. But I tell you that story partly to really underscore how robust in effect this is. It's really similar across all of our brains. What about languages? Well, we got some bilingual people, Portuguese, English, and we found we could train by showing them Portuguese words and then decode when we showed them the equivalent English words. What that means is that most of the brain activity that our classifier is focused on is really about the word meaning, the semantics, not about the surface form of the appearance of the letter sequence. Although in fact, we can see the letter sequence too in certain parts of visual cortex. Words versus pictures, again, very similar. It turns out if I show you, we can train on pictures of items and then decode brain activity when we show you the words. There's a little bit of difference. The evidence is that when you show pictures, there's more activity in parietal cortex and late visual cortex that is diagnostic, that's useful for classification. If you have pictures, you get more of that activity. If you have words, you get less of that. I think that might be due, if you think about it for a second. If I say to you, dog, you've got an idea of what a dog is. But if I show you a picture of my dog, You see the size, you see what kind of dog it is, the shape. And so words are necessarily more abstract than images. And perhaps that has something to do with it. We also started looking, then we got ambitious. We thought, well, what about verbs, for example? And we found out that if we showed verbs in isolation to people, we had absolutely terrible results. There was no ability that we could find to decode, to train a reliable classifier to decode which verb you're reading. However, we later found out that if we paired a verb with a noun, then it worked fine. So we could give the verb cut and the verb heal, and our system really couldn't distinguish this. But if we gave the two-word sentence, surgeons cut and surgeons heal, then the classifier worked fine. My friends in psycholinguistics have pointed out to me that for behavioral studies, people have for a long time thought that nouns carry very grounded meaning, but verbs much less so. That to get the real meaning of a verb, you have to ground it in a sentence. You have to use it in some context. And if you think about like a verb like play, you can see, it really has many different meanings depending on, you could play soccer, you could play Romeo in the production of Romeo and Juliet. You could play cards, you could play the lottery. These are very different concrete concepts. But once I pair the verb with a noun, you get one or the other.
So we know that you can learn to recognize actions. I mean, people have been doing that, learn to recognize cutting. You can see that in the video. So to what extent is what you just said a function of the fact that one is looking at fMRI, which is essentially taking a static picture of the brain, static picture of the, in fact, of the bold effect within the brain, as opposed to an action?
Great question. So I'll repeat it in case people online didn't hear it. The question was, maybe the fact that you don't get verbs is that they're really describing activities, and fMRI gives you a very static picture of the brain. We can only get one fMRI image per second, roughly. And it takes you a sub-second to recognize the words, so we're missing things. Rather than answer that, because I don't really know the answer, let me say that I'm going to show you a movie of what that activity looks like at millisecond resolution in a few slides. Okay, so then we got interested in, well, this is, okay, the good news is that we can train classifiers. There are distinct patterns of neural activity that represent different word meanings. Furthermore, we seem to share them as humanity. We seem to all have pretty much the same patterns. This is a field worthy of study. What would it mean to have a theory of word representations of the brain? So if you think about a theory, is generally some kind of formal system that can make experimentally testable predictions about phenomena you haven't yet measured. So what would that mean here? We thought, well, what if we could build a system where we could give it any noun and it would predict the fMRI activity for that novel when it hadn't been trained?
Is it possible that the nouns can be seen statically, and for the verb you actually have to look at the dynamic or the temporal feature of brain activity?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's right. That's kind of related to Mike's question too.
That's a combination with EEG, for example.
Yeah.
Anyway, so verbs really describe actions, whereas concrete nouns are static things.
Yeah.
So that could be part of it. Okay, so here we got interested in, can we build a system that will predict Can we build a system that understands whether there's a systematicity here that would allow us to predict fMRI activity for arbitrary nouns? And after some work, we came up with a system that looks like this. It predicts the fMRI activity for a new noun in 2 steps. In the first step, it retrieves, for example, for an input noun like telephone, retrieves corpus statistics describing how that word is used in a very large collection of text, representing the word by a vector of these statistics. These days, we would call that an embedding, word embedding. And then in the second stage, it predicts at each of the 10,000 locations in the brain what the activity will be there as a function of that vector of corpus statistics. And we train the system end to end so that it learns what these contributions are. Okay, so what does that look like? So just to give you a feel, let's take these in 2 steps. Suppose I have the word celery. These are the kind of corpus statistics we used in the first version of the system. I just made up 25 verbs, and we looked at how frequently the noun co-occurs with these different verbs. So for example, celery occurs a lot with the verb eat, not so much with the verb ride, whereas airplane occurs a lot with the verb ride, not so much with manipulate. So that's the vector of corpus statistics we take really to represent the meaning, in a sense, of the word. And then from there, we train a system that predicts the activity at any particular voxel, 3-dimensional pixel. The prediction at voxel V is just the sum over those 25 verbs of how frequently the input word, say celery, how frequently the input word W co-occurs with verb I, times some learned parameter that the system learns from the data that we do have. So when you do this, then we can test the system by showing it 2 words it never saw. In this case, celery and airplane. And you can see on the top here, the predicted images, and on the bottom, the actual observed fMRI images. And you can see, even though these predictions aren't perfect, they do capture a bunch of the structure and the neural activity. And so this model has picked up some of the systematicity that is actually being used in that neural code. It's not a big hash code where every word just gets independently a different pattern of neural activity. In fact, there's great systematicity to the degree where you can get these kind of predictions by essentially saying each word can be described in a 25-dimensional space of verb frequency from frequencies of 25 verbs. Yes.
A question. In previous slide, you had that it's harder to identify the location of the verbs, but now you actually use the representation of the verb in order to represent nouns, which you said is easier. Yes. So how does it work?
Well, the verbs turn out to be suitable representations for noun. We never went the other way around and asked, could we do better with verbs if we represent them by co-occurrences with nouns? But one reason we didn't go there is we couldn't even train a classifier to get the verbs in isolation.
Okay.
We did, just to kind of tip my hat on what's coming next, we did find that we can classify verbs quite well once we put them in sentences. So
but
it's really the isolation of the verb that did not lead to repeatable neural activity. Okay, so let me. So we can ask how well this model that's predicting now fMRI images for words it has never seen. We can ask quantitatively how well does it do. One way to set that up is to leave 2 words out during training, and then we will show it 2 two new fMRI images. And we'll tell it, one of them is celery, one of them is airplane. And we'll ask it, which one is which? So if it guessed, then at chance, it should get 50% of those guesses correct. But if it was a meaningless model, it would only get 50% correct. And in fact, averaged over 9 subjects get 79%. And today with better word embeddings, it's closer to 85%. So there's something real going on here. Think about it. What I'm saying is, given 2 words the system has never seen, and the 2 corresponding fMRI images, it can tell you which is which 3 times out of 4. So there is systematicity in this neural code. And furthermore, this model says that systematicity can be approximated by casting each noun, representing each noun as a 25-dimensional vector of verb co-occurrences. So now we could even drill down. We can say, well, what are the learned coefficients associated with each of these verbs? And so, for example, if we look at so now this is not really a brain image. This is an image of the coefficients learned for the verb eat. And again, we never showed any of these subjects any of these verbs, but indirectly through the model, it's learning that to the degree that a noun does co-occur with the verb eat, it's going to add in this pattern of neural activity with a weight that corresponds to the frequency of that verb. But if you look at these weights it has learned, the big red blotch here is in a region that neuroscientists call gustatory cortex because it's affiliated with sense of taste. And similarly, push, this blob is somatosensory cortex. And similarly, the verb run, this blob is in superior temporal sulcus, but that's an area that through other studies, people have associated with perceiving biological motion. Like if you watch a dog running, you'll activate this. So there's a kind of grounding, at least according to this learned model. And there's a lot of converging evidence from a number of experiments that suggests that these representations, these neural representations of concrete nouns really are largely grounded in sensory and motor regions of the brain, the same parts of the brain that would be active if you really interacted with that object. And in a way, it makes sense. You can think of a lot of good hypotheses, maybe we'll talk about them later, about why that evolutionarily would be a sensible way to organize the brain. But anyway, here's the evidence in this case from this model. Okay, so I want to end, this is the part on where. So the take-home messages here are, look, the neural encodings of noun meanings are really distributed around the brain, largely grounded in sensory and motor regions, and very similar across people. They are also patterns of neural activity that can be predicted to some degree of approximation from corpus statistics that they're using with. So those are some of the lessons from the WHERE study. But now, as several of you have remarked, fMRI is kind of slow, isn't it, compared to how fast you understand a word. Does anybody know how fast you understand a word? If I put a word up on the screen, how long does it take you to understand it? 30 seconds probably. The consensus answer is 400 milliseconds. And most people, when you read, if you're reading, say, the morning newspaper, 3 words per second is a typical reading speed. So the study went, given that it's only 400 milliseconds to understand a word, fMRI is really not the imaging method of choice. Instead, we want to use something called magnetoencephalography. And so I'm going to show you a movie of one person seeing the stimulus hand, both word and a line drawing. Here the clock is going to start at 20 milliseconds before the word appears on the screen. Don't you watch the clock. I want you to watch the neural activity. I will read out the clock for you. Okay, so ready? Here's the movie. 0. The word just appeared. 100 milliseconds. 200. 300. 400 milliseconds. That brain just understood the stimulus. So you can see the really dynamic activity in the brain. It's not a static picture. You don't just look at the word and then suddenly poof, this entire three-dimensional thing appears. So what's going on there? And now we can turn back to machine learning and we can ask, well, it's very interesting to see this activity of, or this movie of neural activity. But what we'd really rather see is a movie of the information flow, right? So Gus Sudre, for his PhD, decided to make such a movie by training roughly 1 million classifiers. He trained each classifier on one anatomical region of the brain. It could only look at one region of the brain. And its job was, it also could only look at 50 milliseconds of that movie. And then it had to predict, in this case, not the word we were viewing, but some feature of the word. And we had a list of 229 features. The kind of features you would get if you played 20 questions, like, is it bigger than a bread box? Is it alive? Things like that. And a few perceptual features, like how many letters are in the word? Things like that. So then he trained a separate classifier for each 50 millisecond window, each region of the brain, each one of these features of the stimulus. And with cross-validation, he could easily determine which of those classifiers were useless and which ones actually had the ability to make predictions that were supported by held out data. And so then he made the following movie. He found in the first 50 milliseconds, post-stimulus onset, there was absolutely nothing he could decode from neural activity, from the MEG activity. But at 100 milliseconds, there were several different regions where he could decode the number of letters in the word. Actually, he was decoding, is it greater than 4 letters or 4 or less? So we just kind of split that into a binary question. But nothing about the meaning of the word, just the surface form of the word. At 150, still only perceptual features. At 150 to 200 milliseconds, the first semantic feature was decodable. Is it hairy? Now, in retrospect, I think is it hairy is probably a stand-in for is it alive? But this was the feature that at 250 though, now we see several. Is it hairy? Is it an animal? What about its constitution? Is it hollow, made of wood? At 300 is even more. Can it bite or sting me? Can you pick it up? At 350, even more. At 400, even more. Remember when I said, excuse me, remember when I said the consensus estimate is that 400 milliseconds is how long it takes your brain? This crescendo of decodable features is kind of evidence of that. In fact, when we trained just a single classifier of the word and tried it in every 50 millisecond subwindow, the accuracy is maximum at exactly 400 milliseconds. But here you can see there are a lot of semantic features. and they hang around for a while and kind of decay. Okay, I want to show you some really interesting, just one really interesting thing that comes out of looking at that in more detail. So let's just pick, I'm going to pick two of the features. The first one is the number of letters in the word. Is this a long word or a short word? And I'm going to show you a plot, a little matrix, where along this axis, I'm going to show you time since the stimulus appeared. And along this axis, I'm going to show you 72 different regions of the brain. And the color in each location is going to show, is that information decodable at that time from that region? Now think for a minute what this is going to look like. I never thought it would look like this. So what this is saying, here is the word onset at 0 milliseconds. At around 100 milliseconds, we can suddenly decode the word length, is it a long or a short word, but simultaneously in half a dozen different regions of the brain. And these are not all right next to each other. They're in different lobes. But there's something going on here that results in the human brain suddenly having neural activity in several different locations simultaneously that encodes this feature. Notice also that that feature is no longer decodable by the time we get to 400 milliseconds when you know what the word is. So perhaps this is kind of a transient. Thank you so much. Perhaps this is kind of a transient, but there's something interesting going on here. We still don't understand what's behind it. Now I showed you this for the perceptual feature word length. What if we look instead at a semantic feature like graspability? Is the stimulus word something you could grasp? Then the plot looks like this. Now, two things here. One is the semantic features are decodable much later, more like 250 to 300 milliseconds for graspability. But again, there are, in this case, I can see 7 distinct brain regions where that feature, once it's decodable anywhere, it's decodable simultaneously in 7 different brain regions. So it has that same property that word length had. Notice also that in this case, once it becomes decodable, it doesn't just fade away. It stays, it persists past through the 400 milliseconds where you're figuring out what the word really is. So these semantic features persist longer, but just like the perceptual features, when they appear simultaneously multiple places. So I think there are a lot of interesting studies to be done to look into this, or for example, be very interesting to look at what some people call functional connectivity, where the correlation in the time series of the neural signals in these different regions that simultaneously encode the feature. Okay, so the take-home message from this part of the talk about when is that these neural encodings really, they're complete at 400 milliseconds. I should have asked you before I showed you the results, what do you think is going to happen? Because before we did this, we were debating, did your brain just like stare at the word for a while and then poof, the entire semantic signature appears in neural activity? Well, the answer is no, that's not at all what happens. What happened was, as you saw in the Gus's movie, the features trickle in over time. They persist, they all persist once they appear through 400 milliseconds, but they don't all appear at the same time. Remember, is it Harry was the first one, or maybe is it alive?
It's so interesting. So words which are shorter, I would just assume, I wouldn't know, I assume they're faster to decode, but here it shows that the analysis of the timing of the length come the same time, and you don't find difference. You don't find any difference. It will be harder to understand or to decode longer?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're pointing out that short words are generally more frequently occurring words, and maybe the brain would figure out to decode those more quickly. I can't say yes or no to whether that happens. We looked at that a little bit, but we didn't really look at it in enough detail.
Also, how do you correlate now the imaging with the fMRI? Because in the fMRI we saw an image and here we saw video.
Right. So here we're getting an image with MHE, we're basically getting one entire image every millisecond. Whereas with fMRI, we got kind of a,
So it's like an average of something?
right, so you might think, oh, the fMRI is an average of that. So we actually did a paper where we tried to compare the MEG and the fMRI. So many people have looked at this question, not just us.
Yeah.
And the answer is it's frustratingly difficult to predict either one from the other. And I think the reason in part is due to the biophysics. It turns out that fMRI is measuring oxygen fluctuations in your brain, which for reasons that are mysterious to me, happen to correlate very well with neural activity, but they're delayed. First there's neural activity, then your brain squirts more oxygenated blood there. MEG is a completely different physics. It's measuring literally passively the magnetic fields that are coming out of your brain that are generated by very tiny electrical currents, which are, where would you get a very tiny electrical current? When neurons fire. Where would you get the biggest electrical current? When a number of neurons happen to be aligned, their axons are aligned and they fire simultaneously. So the physics that leads to these two signals is quite different. And that explains, at least in part, why it's hard to align.
It's very interesting. I think with the fMRI, one of the suggestion is that after you use your neurons, you need to bring back sugar and oxygen for the next step. And that's why when it's kind of used, you're bringing it on, showing where recently.
Yeah, the body is really clever. And I think you're right, that if you start burning energy in some part of your brain, a good guess is you're going to keep burning energy there, so let's send some oxygen. Okay, so there's the where and the when. Want to do a quick version of how. Good, we're still fine. Okay, so we have seen that there are these spatial patterns of activity that are similar across our brains. We've seen something about the information sequence, I'll say. I won't say flow because we still don't fully understand that, but at least the sequence of information encoded in the brain during word comprehension. How is this happening? So to give away the answer, we don't know, but we want to study it. And so I want to show you some recent work. And since many people here are AI people, you're probably thinking, well, finally, this is what I'm thinking, finally in the last decade, finally in the last decade, we have computer programs that can perform some of these language processing functions that we're asking the brain to perform. Why don't we use those computational models that AI gives us as a candidate hypothesis, a candidate algorithm, and try to align the sequence of what we see in the brain to what the sequence of things these natural language AI systems do. So that's, in a nutshell, what we're up to these days. So, in fact, this is a paradigm for studying how in the brain. Then has also been used to study computer vision. So people, for example, have the idea of the paradigm is let's create a computer program that does what we're asking the brain to do. Give the same stimulus to the computer program as the brain. And then, for example, if that stimulus is an image, we could run it through a convolutional neural network, and we could look at the intermediate stages of activation in this artificial neural network and see whether that aligns in any way with the sequence of neural activity we see in visual cortex. And people have done that, looked at it. And to make that correspondence, we could try to learn a linear mapping from, say, the activation in the neural network at some stage of processing and the activation we observe in the brain during its sequence of processing. So that's the idea for a paradigm for studying how. As I mentioned, people have done this to some degree with computer vision. We thought, well, let's try it for language. And so we considered 4 different computer algorithms, as you could think of them as playing the role of 4 alternative hypotheses of how the brain is processing a sentence. Then we gave these systems simple sentences like the dog ate the bone. And we looked at the sequence of neural activity and the sequence of artificial neural network activity. Now, to imagine, so that you understand what the human subjects in our experiments were seeing. If you're in our experiment, this is what you're seeing. We're scanning your brain. So pay attention. Here we
So
go.
it's still with the MEG?
This is MEG, so we're still, well, actually, yeah, mostly we use MEG. Here we go. Okay. So one word every 500 milliseconds. And you very quickly advance using this. Okay, what does the brain do? Here's the MEG data. This axis shows the 306 sensors around the brain. This axis shows time, and there's a new word every 500 milliseconds. But if you looked at this brain activity, and again, the color indicates magnitude and direction of the MEG signal. But if you looked at this, you could tell me there's some repeated structure here. Sure enough, every time a new word appears, you can see it here in the brain. The surprising thing to me is look what happens when the sentence is done. There's an explosion of brain activity after the sentence. That, I mean, in retrospect, I can say, oh yeah, but we didn't anticipate this. And in fact, there is information about the sentence content that can be decoded from this post-sentence burst of neural activity. But so that's what the data looks like. And so now, how do we try to align that data with what, let's say, Bert would do with that same sentence? Well, what we do is we actually give Bert 5 different, we call it 5 different times. Because remember, you saw the words in sequence one at a time. And that brain activity that we just looked at is the result of this kind of sequential unfolding word by word of the sentence. So we want to do the same thing with Bert. So first we just show it the, we see what Bert has, and we see if we can learn a mapping that aligns to what the brain is doing when it sees them. Then we show Bert the dog. Then we show it the dog ate, and so forth. The system has to use the same linear mapping in each of these cases. So that's the setup. And then we use simple linear mapping ridge regression in this case to try to align BERT and Elmo and a couple other systems. So what we find, oh, I see. I should also point out how we're going to test which model we prefer. It's basically the same idea that we use for single concrete noun testing. We're going to say, here are two sentences that were not part of the training set, or two sentence fragments. And we're going to say, one of these images we're showing you is when the person was reading this fourth word in the sentence for the dog ate the. And the other image is when the person was reading this fourth word, but the previous words were girl. And so now the system has to tell us which of those brain images was collected during the fourth word of this sentence versus the fourth word of this sentence. Okay, so that's the setup. And it turns out you can do this quite well. BERT is the best of the four approaches we considered. And in fact, we tried using different layers of BERT, and because BERT has like a couple dozen layers, we found the intermediate layers of BERT were the best predictors of the neural activity. Remember, the first input layers of BERT are looking at the actual input words, they're encoding. The outer layers of the ultimate layer of BERT is predicting missing masked words. So these intermediate layers, in a way, it's kind of reasonable that they would be the layers that capture the meaning. It is flagged.
I'm a little bit confused. Do you mind to explain us again? Maybe I didn't hear. Do you mind to explain us again? So the BERT, for example, is from words to missing words, so words to words. And then you talked about previously about classifier from words to brain or from brain to words.
Yes,
So,
so
if you just can,
so BERT is a system that's trained, people call it a transformer architecture, but what it's doing, it's trained to predict the next word and the next sentence. But also during training, people will mask out words that are in the sentence and ask it to predict those masked out words as well. So this is a way of training a natural language processing system that forces that system to learn to represent information about, I'm trying to say this in as neutral a way as possible, learn to represent information about the word sequence in a way that allows it to, if you mask out any word or ask for the next word, allows it to predict that with high fidelity. So even though that's what it's trained to do, it has been found that BERT and its successors like GPT-3 and Palm are able to do these representations as learning are so useful that it has revolutionized the field of machine translation, of generating text automatically, even the field of question answering, part of speech tagging. It's really a remarkable revolution that's been going on for the last 5 years in the natural language understanding field. So even though BERT is trained to do this, predict the masked word, it's been found that what representations are just incredibly useful for many different so I'm going to I will end soon. But let me just say, we also looked at which parts of the brain are best predicted by this. And unsurprisingly to some people, the left temporal lobe is the best predicted part of the brain. That would be unsurprising to some people because some people believe that's where language, most of language functionality is localized. But we found that, in fact, even the parts of the brain that are predicted poorly, where, you know, it's really remarkably effective. So even in frontal lobes, where, for example, with the concrete noun experiments, we found very little frontal activity involved in representing concrete noun units. What we do find is sentence comprehension involves a lot of frontal activity, so it's the compositional process. Okay, so
Of course, the encoding of the information from the first time you see the sentence or you see the word. So the comprehension component, there is some activity of the brain and they haven't seen it in.
so the delay in the brain, what we're predicting here is each 500 millisecond chunk. So, and as we saw in the when part of the talk, your brain comprehends a word in 400 milliseconds, isolated words. And so we're assuming that the 500 millisecond chunk of time series that we're predicting includes all of this dynamics that are happening while you're perceiving and understanding the word and hopefully fitting it into the sentence. So that's at least the working assumption.
Also a question on the methodology of the classification. You said this is 2x2 classification.
Yes.
Which means on the brain image, we have a girl it and dog it. And so we have the two brain images. And for the bird, we also have the two sentences and have this middle layer, two latent code. And given this pairs, you train a classifier to find the correlation, right?
Almost. What we do is we train the model to predict from bird exactly what this 500 milliseconds time series will look like.
Yeah, okay.
And so then we give bird these two sentence fragments, the dog ate the and the girl ate the, and we ask it to predict the 500 millisecond chunk that we'll see during the fourth word. And it makes two predictions, one for each of those two. And then we ask which of these predictions best fits which of these observed.
Which is like you have a prop model, right? You pre-train the bird and you kind of do an extra classifier based on that.
Right, but we'll actually use cosine similarity just to
okay.
do that comparison. So yeah, there's nothing. We tried more sophisticated things, but didn't seem to make that much of a difference.
And the same question for the timing issue is for each semantics, we have each individual classifier, right? I mean, is that a human made? Is that animal, right?
Right. For each word, we had a different classifier. Then when we built the model that predicts the generative model that generates the fMRI image for arbitrary words, then that kind of replaces the collection of classifiers one for word with just a generative model that handles
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to stop here. And
Thank you
because
so much.
I'd
Yeah,
rather have a discussion than a one-on-one.
So let's take. Yes, please go ahead.
So one question, one high-level question is, we have seen how our pre-trained models can actually predict brain activity. Question is there something that we can learn from this that actually can inform the way that we should build our model? So for example, if we know that certain words are located in a certain area, is this something that we can give to our models and say, maybe you should organize yourself in a way that those are
Yes, I love that question. It's the right question. My colleague Leila Webby is very interested in that question and has done some experiments trying to see if she could improve the language mod, the AI models by training in various ways using the brain data that we see. Having looked at her results, I would say that the jury is still out. It's not clear that we can do that, but you're shining light on it, a really interesting question. And I think, it should be like the results I was showing here had to do with what part of the brain activity can we predict from birth? But the other question of what part of birth's activity is predictable from brain activity and what parts aren't? Very interesting questions. And by the way, keep in mind that all of this brain activity that we're observing is nowhere near the neural level of activity that's actually going on. So even that nice spatial resolution fMRI image I was showing you, where maybe a voxel is 2 or 3 cubic millimeters, that's still 10 to the 5th neurons inside that piece of the brain. For MEG, it's much worse. So we're nowhere near looking at the neural levels. So one of the things that we have to always keep in mind is that there is stuff going on in the brain that we are not able to observe with the coarse resolution imaging that we're doing. So for example, we spent a lot of work trying to see if we could decode earlier words in the sentence while you're reading one of the later words. And finally, we succeeded in doing that, but we thought it was a big triumph. But if we could see all the activity, obviously you remember the words. So your brain is doing things that were hard for us.
We have time for 2 more questions, please. So yeah, let's take one.
Okay, I have lots of questions. I'll ask one just to give a chance for others. If we talk about this amazing research and go to healthcare applications, such as, just take an example, mental health or Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
What's your thought of taking this forward to understand these diseases?
Yes, there's a lot of work to move this kind of stuff into clinical. And just classifying brain image data according to disease is one line of work. I'll give you 2 examples. Marcel Just, my collaborator, my primary collaborator, has done a lot of work on suicidal thinking. And he has found that he could train a system to look at your neural activity when you're viewing certain kinds of stimuli. Part of the research is figuring out what kind of stimuli, but then your brain activity allows his classifier to distinguish people who have previously reported suicidal thoughts and haven't. So I think there's promising future for that kind of work. My other colleague, Leila Webby, has done some work related to depression. I keep my answers short.
Con, please, yeah.
Thank you very much for the great talk as always. So well, I have kind of a rather long question, but basically our brain activity encodes the essential meaning, right, of the words and sentences. So on the one hand, our brain is active because of words, right? We see the word and we have some thoughts. But on the other hand, actually we create words, right? Because
Yes.
of our, so from this perspective, actually it's some kind of a task of inferring the underlying concepts from what we can see. By that, I mean the following thing. Do you have any hypothesis regarding the principles with which we can encode the underlying meaning and derive the underlying concepts and their relations by making use of, say, sentences or words? So that would be very useful if you want to find a way so that machines can automatically learn the underlying meaning from observations. So essentially about the principle under which we can do causal representation learning.
Wow, yeah, this is, it's not an easy question, but it's a great question. My thinking is, children understand a lot of concepts long before they use words. They know what mom is before they have the word mom. I believe that there are certain, that the concepts that we actually have are primarily created non-linguistically, you know, based on our goals and the environment we're interacting in.
To save energy and so on.
Right. And then we acquire language, and we get this amazing explosion, I think, in two ways. One, now we can communicate. We knew what mom was, now we've got a word for it. But maybe more important, we also get all this cultural knowledge dumped into our head, which gets us to think about distinctions that maybe we never would have thought about on our own, because now we're harvesting what an entire history of humanity has come up with. But I think there's a fundamental opportunity, flaw is the word I was going to use, but I'll say opportunity. If you look at the current work in, say, transformer models in natural language, where people are basically saying, we're going to give the web to train these systems. It's all words, and we'll be able to get everything recovered, but that seems way too hard in a sense compared to what us humans get to do. We know a lot of concepts before we ever see a single word, and we get to use these multiple channels. So to be fair, a lot of people are now looking, who are working in transformer kind of architectures, are now looking at, well, let's do multimodal transformer training on movies. They have videos as well as sounds, as well as sometimes text. But I think, so this all makes me actually very optimistic about the next 10 years, because I think the field of AI is going to more and more be training these large models using more realistic multimodal data. And I also think it's going to be a very interesting 10 years for neuroscience, because really up until 5 years ago, we never had a decent system that could do language processing. And up until 10 years ago, we never had a decent system that could do visual processing. So it's only now that we actually have computer algorithms that could be used as kind of the substrate for building hypotheses about algorithms.
Thank you.